Hello, Cardstack community. Welcome to Web3 Watch. I'm Chrissy, the founding director of the Cardstack project, coming to you from the land of the Web3. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Nick Z, the co-founder and contributor of Evmos, who is working on really interesting intersection of EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine technology, and the Cosmos ecosystem. Welcome, Nick.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks, Chris.
Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts about these kind of ecosystem colliding, both in the technology and what it can bring, but also from cultural values as far as what's going on, that people are using this new application of familiar but new combination that could be interesting in unlocking the true potential of Web3, not just as a way to move the crypto primitive forward, but also to engage a user in a new way. So tell us a little bit about your journey into this space we loosely call Web3, which is inclusive of some of the high and low level stack, which we work and tell us how you came up with this idea to start this kind of flagship chain for this SDK.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for the intro there. So my journey into Web3 starts with teaching. I am an engineer by trade. And kind of early on, I joined around early 2017, late 2016. And at the time, there was almost no educational material out there. And so me and a couple of folks, namely my co-founder for Evmos, we got together. Evmos wasn't a thing back then. But we got together and we put out some of the first material offered kind of, worldwide on developing with smart contracts on Ethereum. And we put this out for free, mainly at kind of like the local university level. We taught classes and kind of engaged with the space in that way. Also at the time, this other interesting thing happened where we were introduced to the Cosmos ecosystem fairly on. So we were developing in the Ethereum space with Solidity and like early versions of MetaMask and Remix IDE. Foundry didn't exist back then. Hardhat didn't exist back then. Truffle.js was barely a framework back then as well. And so it was a kind of a real pleasure to see things evolve and break and then unbreak and then break again afterwards. And so kind of Cosmos. I don't know if you want to dive in there and give that a few minutes of airtime. Yeah,
I met the Tendermint guy at a event in the Midtown Manhattan in my early days of crypto exploring BTC and ETH and stuff like that. So I'm aware that there's a long history in the consensus algorithm, but less familiar with when that becomes like its own thing with IBC and stuff.
Yeah. And so Tendermint has like Tendermint and Cosmos more broadly has a long and illustrious history, almost as long as Ethereum's. And I think like Jay Kwan, who is the first person who put out a paper, Jay Kwan and Ethan Buchman, kind of are associated with the founding of Cosmos. And one of them put out a paper on Tendermint fairly early on, and rumor has it that is back in 2014 is what got Vitalik kind of interested in exploring proof of stake in the early days. And so
I see. Interesting.
Yeah. It's
mental virus root, right? Like that's patient zero here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, at the time, folks like Zaki, Vlad Zamfir, Ethan Buchman, Jay Kwan, it was all very like a small group of people, especially in 2014. Kind of, they all knew each other, and I don't know how much they associate these days, but this is kind of like legend has it that that kind of they were all talking. And
that's cool.
Kind of Ethereum launches and goes through its ebbs and flows, and then Jay Kwan and Ethan Buchman on the Cosmos side kind of go away and kind of invent a lot of these like underlying theses. They invent like Tendermint, which kind of makes like a lot of like older like BFT consensus research like relevant to blockchains.
Right.
And Tendermint, for those who don't know, is the consensus. It's the consensus algorithm and also the consensus engine that powers a lot of the Cosmos chains today. And so Cosmos, the thing that people really remember Cosmos for really is the app chain thesis, right? So in a world where Ethereum kind of introduced smart contracts to the equation, to this like equation that previously like was dominated by like Bitcoins and transactions, right? Just like transfer transactions from one person to the other. There was like a ton of other stuff you could do with Bitcoin script, like colored coins, but really like Ethereum's key innovation was smart contracts and the count state model. And so in a world where Ethereum kind of said, hey, we are the world computer, everything will live on a shared state, like Ethereum being the state machine and everything else being built on top of it, Cosmos
Right.
kind of took a different approach from the onset and said, hey, actually, it doesn't really make sense for every application to share block space. We think that each application should have endemic block space, its own sovereign block space that it can do whatever it wants with.
Right.
And kind of like 2017, 2018, I remember kind of being in the space at the time and seeing for the first time like CryptoKitties kind of emerge as one of the most interesting, pertinent use cases for Web3 users at the time. And I say Web3 users, there are probably only like a few thousand users overall in the world of Ethereum at that point, but by rough estimates, of course. Maybe low tens of thousands or something. But anyway, so CryptoKitties comes out, and immediately people start to see the problem with single shared state machine, single block space application layer, right?
Got really crowded. It's like everybody is like rushing in to adopt a kitty, and then it's like filling up the whole place, and nobody has air. Oxygen's gone.
Right. Yeah. So all the transactions on Ethereum kind of were for CryptoKitties. People were paying ludicrous prices to get their transactions included in a block, which notably, like in essence, that's kind of the gas model working as intended. But most notably, what did it mean for everybody else? Like, I think that's the key thing here that is important not to forget. It's that, hey, users of Uniswap and Compound and Maker and all these other applications that were built on Ethereum that were kind of early, all those users could not use the products that they were trying to use, even though they had nothing to do with CryptoKitties, right? That's the kind of key point here. And it's the key point that we'll keep coming back to, because this does not reflect at all the Web2 experience, right? That a Web2 user kind of might expect. Like, if they are using like Facebook.com and there's a slowdown on Facebook.com, then they can probably use Google.com if there's not like an internet shutdown or something. And that'll be okay. There's no dependency like on one or the other. It's not like they share some sort of like cloud provider, like quote unquote block space, right? It's the simplest way I can kind of frame it here, right? And so Cosmos was early to the app chain thesis, where they kind of said, listen, every application should just run on its own blockchain. There's no doubt about it. But then you kind of lose this like guarantee of atomicity of communication between applications, right? The benefit of deploying an application to a shared state layer is that every application can by default talk to each other and has this like kind of underlying shared API that can be understood by other applications, right?
And then there's an assumption that if you want to talk to each other, you can, but you have to like wait a time until you can confirm with confidence that there's not going to be a reorg, and that essentially means that you have to wait for a package to arrive in 2 weeks before communicating, and it gets rid of that immediacy that people were like on that single chain was experiencing.
Right. So I think like what you're pointing out is like for a probabilistic finality chain to communicate cross-chain at the time, it was like you could not build like a real experience on top of that.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas like if you built multiple applications on one chain, all of them can communicate kind of atomically, right? Yeah. And so the Cosmos folks kind of thought about this. They were like, well, if we're building applications that each live on their own chain, they need to be able to communicate with each other, right? And so, Cosmos was kind of early to proof of stake. It was early to Tendermint and fast finality, where you no longer relied on probabilistic finality. You had instant finality, where a block could be constructed and then instantly confirmed after that with no possibility of reorgs.
Right.
That was the Tendermint piece.
Yes.
Right. You had the application chain. And lastly, you had IBC, which was the final key innovation here. And IBC, Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, was a protocol by which application chains could trustlessly talk to each other without the need for exogenous like an exogenous attack surface being introduced. You had like the source chain and the destination chain, and the security guarantees that those two chains made were the only guarantees that IBC relied on, because it uses light client proofs. And so now you have the final piece of the puzzle where you have like these applications that each live on their own stack. And now they can all communicate with each other atomically, meaning like either their transaction succeeds completely or fails completely. There's no kind of like, oh, it succeeded halfway and only like a little bit of your tokens were locked and minted on the other chain.
You gave me this, but you didn't give me that. That's going to be bad, right? You want that the actually happened and a trade happened or didn't.
Totally, exactly. So, the key genius that Cosmos folks kind of built was that they made this all available via an SDK. They said, hey, if people are going to be building application chains, then they need to have a development kit ready for them to build these application chains, because building chains from scratch is hard, right? Even kind of like, even if we give you Tendermint and an implementation for Tendermint, which is again the consensus engine. Now, by the way, it's been renamed to Comet BFT. The later implementations are, but anyway, let's just refer to it as Tendermint.
Better branding.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
We're going to give you an SDK that includes Tendermint, that includes IBC.
IBC, yeah.
And then lastly, it also includes the kind of all the pieces you need to construct your application layer logic on top of this stack that relies on IBC and Tendermint. Right. We give you proof of stake. We give you a ledger, which defines kind of like the majority of your application layer state. And then any other custom logic you want to include on your application layer, you can kind of build a module for your stack, right? Build a custom module, right? And so was born like the Cosmos SDK is what it was called. And the reason I'm talking about all this is because Evmos' journey starts with the Cosmos SDK. Right?
That's your foundation. That's your base layer that you built upon. Right,
exactly. So by the time we were looking at Cosmos in 2017, the Cosmos SDK was kind of already in being developed, right? The Cosmos Hub, I think, like one of the first chains launched with the Cosmos SDK, was launched around 2019 and 2020, about that time. And then Osmosis, one of the most profound kind of displays of the capabilities of the Cosmos SDK, was launched, I think, in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, basically around that time is that's kind of the timeline we're talking about. And 2021 is when Evmos first kind of begins being developed, right? Now, taking a step back, in 2017, there was this concept, this idea, right? In a world where we have all these application chains, we still want a platform for EVM developers to build on top of. So Ethereum developers still need to build within Cosmos, right?
If you want those qualities of finality and optimicity and stuff like that.
Exactly. So if EVM builders want to build in a world where you have application chains that you can talk to natively, trustlessly, permissionlessly, if you want fast finality, if you want proof of stake very early on, you should be able to do that. And this idea was called Ethermint. So Ethermint is, of course, Ethereum Tendermint, right? And so several teams tried to launch an EVM, an Ethereum virtual machine, as a Cosmos SDK module. So they tried to launch a chain that was built with the Cosmos SDK that used the EVM. So it was a Cosmos SDK chain that provided EVM developers, that people who are familiar with building smart contracts instead of chains, a platform to deploy their smart contracts on top of.
I see. Right? Yeah.
Ethermint as a chain was never launched. And so, 2017 went by, 2018, 2019. By 2018, I think we were on version 2 of Ethermint, and it still had not been launched. 2019, 2020, 2021 goes by, and Ethermint is still not launched. Whereas the Cosmos Hub has been launched, Osmosis as like a major proof of concept for how IBC would work, proved out that the tech worked. The tech was stable enough to have product market fit.
Right.
And Ethermint had still not been launched. And at the time, you have to understand, in 2017, one of the few EVM chains was Ethereum. By 2021, you had Optimism and Arbitrum launching. You had having been live for some time without a token. I don't recall exactly. You had Polygon had already launched, Avalanche had already launched. You had a number of other EVM chains, Harmony, Phantom, etc. And of course, Ethereum had all already launched, right? And so the ecosystem, there was Neon Labs deploying an EVM to Solana. Every ecosystem seemed to have like their own version of the EVM. Aurora on Near, etc. And so you have to understand that in 2021, like the market for EVM block space was not as interesting anymore, at least for us as the Evmos core development team. Yeah. And so when we
can't just lead with that as the only kind of value, right? Because that value has been satisfied with other consensus models and even like execution models.
Exactly. And we knew that there was still appetite in Cosmos for EVM block space. But Cosmos also was kind of developing its own versions. You could take VMs like the Move VM developed by Facebook or Solana's VM and port it over to Cosmos, and it would probably run just fine. You'd have to make some adjustments and stuff, but largely those efforts were either underway or there were kind of like there were inklings of it beginning, right? And Cosmos itself was developing its own runtime, Cosmosm, right? Which is kind of Rust-like. Right? Yeah. And so when we were, kind of looking to work on our next project, we looked at Ethermint as like an interesting project, but we knew at the time that the vision for Ethermint that we had would not be limited to just an EVM and Cosmos. Because we knew that, as I established earlier, the market for kind of EVM block space, generic EVM block space, had already been satisfied. And there's no point in building something that wouldn't have kind of like this unique value proposition out of the gate. Right? And with that, we picked up, so Ethermint had been this open source idea that was, had been worked on by several teams in the past and had never succeeded. And so we wanted to take this community idea and we got a grant from the Cosmos Hub's community pool via Proposal 44 to begin working on it. And so we were grant funded for a long time. And to be clear, a grant is non-dilutive public funding, right? So as
public good. The community want to see that happen. They want to have you work on it, in exchange of having that exist.
Exactly. So as far as I know, Evmos is one of the few L1s so far launched as a public good. Now later on, there were a few other folks who also used a similar model, but we'll get to that. And so we got this grant from the community hub, from the Cosmos Hub community pool, and we brought Evmos to life. And now Evmos was kind of the evolution of the Ethermint vision. It had its own scope, it had its own vision. It would cover what Ethermint was intended to do in the first place. So basically fulfill that EVM on Cosmos purpose. But we converted Ethermint into a public good in itself because we were funded as a public good. And so it made sense to make it so that other people could reuse Ethermint as a public good. And so we converted Ethermint to be the EVM module within Cosmos.
I see.
Evmos itself, the chain, was the flagship implementation of Ethermint within the Cosmos ecosystem.
Right. Not the only ship, and you're not even aiming to be the biggest ship, or you're aiming to be the leading ship, or how many ships do you want?
That's a great question. I think like biggest, best, first, like all these words have like different interpretations and meanings. The thing that I think is certain is that Evmos is going to continue to be the kind of like the canary in the coal mine for Ethermint developments, right? So us as the Evmos core development team, we're actually a collection of contributors, not like a certain formal team, but it's the work that we've done that have brought, like, for example, MetaMask compatibility and compatibility of all EVM tooling to Cosmos.
Right.
Prior to our work, like you would not have been able to use MetaMask with a Cosmos chain. The signing wouldn't have worked out as cleanly. And so like working on like compatibility with Ledger, working on compatibility with a variety of other hardware wallets,
Right.
working on compatibility with things between like the state models of what Cosmos's database is using and the EVM Ethereum native database, etc. Like there's all this integration work that even post launch we were still working on
Right.
because we wanted to get the chain out and live to prove that the Ethermint vision is alive and well in Evmos. But there's a ton of work to be done still in getting the EVM of Cosmos integrated with all of the tooling that Ethereum developers know and love. And really,
and it's necessary at some point, as someone is not entirely clear when the boundary of usability is limiting at the technical aspects of just everything has to just work. Otherwise, like if it doesn't work in like the ledger, then it doesn't work for someone. You don't want that to be a leaky abstraction where it's just like Ethereum except for these 100 things. Those things 100%. Do need to be like killed like one at a time.
100%. And to be clear, like the Ethermint vision would not be fulfilled. Like we could not have other people using Ethermint if it did not work properly, right? If these seamless integrations did not work out of the gate, then all of these other developers who wanted to build on top of Ethermint, both build their own Ethermint chains and also build dApps on top of the Cosmos EVM, they could not make that work if there was no like Ledger integration, for example. Right. If there was no MetaMask integration. If you can't build with Foundry, if you can't build with Hardhat, etc. Like it would have not been ideal, right? And so a lot of 2022, so Evmos we begin work on Evmos in 2021. We're grant funded and we work up until April of 2022 to get Evmos launched. And we continue to be grant funded for another like half year after that, while we're working on this integration work, its infrastructure work, and making sort of the tooling reach parity with what developers were used to on Ethereum.
Right. Yeah, I love the word parity. Obviously, that is a word of an organization within the Web3 space. But like the idea here is that parity shifts, right? As an ecosystem like Ethereum evolves, even the native layer 2 rollups has to reach parity, and I'm sure it's going to be a continuous journey.
Right on. Yeah, it's a moving target constantly, and that's why it's so important. That's why I say like Evmos will continue to be the canary in the coal mine for Ethermint, because you need like this like one flagship implementation to kind of lead the way to be like the lighthouse in the dark for the rest of the Ethermint Evmos fork ecosystem out there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, as you kind of like, steer this flagship and kind of, be the light that shines and kind of open up the water and tell other people what's coming and then resolving the issues ahead and aligning. What are the new frontiers, kind of mixing metaphors a little bit that this work now can explore, right? So obviously bringing the capability of the Internet of Blockchains idea that was kind of baked into the original marketing of Cosmos, I think is still app-chain thesis. And also bringing the practicality and the use cases being accumulated within the EVM development space, within dApps, what people are doing with them. What are you seeing the intersections? Are they just like, kind of like the Avalanche way of doing things is like, hey, it's like Ethereum, but on AVAX, right? It's a little bit of like, not quite imitated, but certainly with the quality and the finality, there's certainly advantages to that. Totally. But this seems a little bit different because you're dealing with instead of an instance of a monolithic chain just somewhere else, it's a network. What are the applications you're seeing that's gaining traction that actually explore that possibility space?
Totally, yeah. So what I will, I'll start off with kind of like a big bold claim, and we can kind of dive into it a little bit. So Evmos was built from the onset with the idea that the applications that you build on Evmos you cannot build anywhere else, right? And like the question there is like, okay, how's that possible? Because it's an EVM, and EVMs kind of all do the same thing, right? Okay. Well, kind of like there were a ton. So after this CryptoKitties incident back in like 2017, 18, a lot of folks launched products that, and projects that espouse this like idea of like scaling Ethereum. We've heard this over and over again. We want to scale Ethereum's capabilities. Rollups, like the sole purpose of rollups is to scale Ethereum, right? Nobody's like, not too many people are thinking about rolling up to other chains, like, right? It's just like about scaling Ethereum.
Ethereum, but more of it, right? Like
yes,
more for everybody. Yeah,
right. Or the other element that was done here is we will be Ethereum. We're going to be Ethereum killers, right? Like, so the Avalanches and the Solanas of the world. Solana is not an EVM chain, but this is kind of like the narrative that they used as well.
Yes.
It's that we're going to be faster Ethereum. We're going to, our execution model is going to be different, or our consensus model is going to reach finality first. And then a number of other, applications were also kind of doing this. Like, I think the exception to this is like Gnosis chain, that kind of thrived on the idea that it was still Ethereum aligned, but it was completely independent from Ethereum. Right?
But Gnosis chain also has a little bit of a canary in the coal mine thing, as a gesture. It's like, we'll try it out first. Didn't really quite happen. The merge happened on mainnet before, but that vision, I
for DAO tooling,
it's really cool.
I love Gnosis chain. I actually think what they're doing is fantastic. And so. Yeah, what's interesting here is like Evmos has never kind of been that Ethereum killer kind of mindset. Right. Like for Evmos, it started off as a community-driven idea, community-funded. The way the core team at least sees Evmos is as an extension of Ethereum's capabilities. And that's where the Cosmos SDK comes in. That's where most notably IBC comes in, right? And going back to the idea of like, what is the Web2 and Web2 end user, and most notably developer experience, that is what's important to us when we think about where we want to take Evmos. And note that as a community-driven idea, the Evmos core development team's roadmap is one of many kind of proposals for taking Evmos forward. I'd like to think that the Evmos core development team's roadmap incorporates a lot of community feedback, and will continue to do so. But when we think about the Web2 user experience and the developer experience, most notably, like I mentioned, we really think that there is parity, that word again, there is parity to be reached in Web3 as well. Like, we shouldn't be happy with the status quo. We shouldn't be happy with the fact that we have to do things like switch networks or switch private keys to, for certain applications or what have you. The end user never has to care about what cloud provider their application is using. They just care about the application itself. Right? And so how do we get to a world in Web3 where the end user only has to care about the application? The focus is on the application, not the underlying blockchain, right? Not having to think about whether the underlying blockchain is an L1, whether it's a rollup, whether you've had to bridge over, is the bridge secure? All of these questions that go through a user's mind and a developer's mind when they're building applications are things of what we consider, what we want to target as the future for Web3 is things of the past, right? Yeah. And a future where developers don't need to think about this cannot be anything else except cross-chain, right? Because applications need to be built on stacks that best serve their purpose.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And from there, that just signals to us, okay, the app chain thesis is correct. It's the correct thesis, right? From there, where do you go, right? And you've had Celestia kind of come out and propose the modular stack, which again is in the correct direction here in terms of giving developers sovereignty to decide on the trade-offs that make the most sense for their own applications, for their own user base, right? We're not going to pretend as core developers for L1 tech or blockchain technology that we know everything about an end user's needs and wants and whatnot. But we know that developers who build products for their end users probably know the best. And so how do we develop the best possible tooling and product for these developers to build for their end users?
Right.
And so there are, a couple of weeks back, we published our manifesto, the Evmos manifesto, which kind of outlines the direction that the community has been sort of alluding to for a long time, and the direction that the Evmos core development team wants to take Evmos in. Now that all the integration work of 2022, the performance improvements, the bug fixes are all obviously they're always going to be ongoing, but the majority of that work is behind us. What is the path forward? What is the next evolution for Ethermint and Evmos in the future? And what that looks like is, first and foremost, EVM extensions, right? So if you've heard of the idea of precompiles, EVM extensions kind of builds on top of that. And basically what it is a way to extend Evmos's EVM in order to do things that Ethereum's EVM cannot do and cannot dream of doing in today's environment. For various kind of like political or technical reasons, Ethereum is slow to adopt like new innovations. I think there have been various proposals for things like account abstraction and sharded state, like via blobs, and all these EIPs out there that can't really be implemented. Whereas Evmos can move quickly because for a variety of reasons, right? Because Evmos is newer, secures less value overall, et cetera, right?
Yeah, you're already sensing that with account abstraction, even if Vitalik's idea was like, well, let's not touch that part, let's add this part, and it's already kind of like not quite fossilized, but there's an acknowledgement of some immovable bits, right, in a software sense, just as software matures.
Yeah, there's this ossification, right, around Ethereum stack, which is fine. Ossification will come to Evmos too, but the core point here is that EVM extensions will continue to be developed, not just for Evmos, but for any fork of Evmos in the future. I'll get to that in a second. And so what kind of EVM extensions, you asked, I think the very first question you asked, and I don't think I've gotten there yet, is what kind of applications are able to be built on
because we talk about intersections. So we think, okay, like you have EVM as a bubble, and then Cosmos. Intersection seems like a tinier sliver than that, but when you put two technology together, it's almost like a chemical reaction, right? You put two things together, a new thing forms, that new thing allows you to do the thing you couldn't do before. That's where Venn diagram fails us, right? So what is this new molecule that is the EVM but Cosmos allow people to build and do that wasn't possible before? That's I think we started there, and that I think we're getting there.
Right. And so if you had the Venn diagram of Cosmos and Ethereum, the things that I would take away is like, the interoperability of Cosmos and the programmability of Ethereum coming together, right? There's all this like battle-tested, hardened tooling around building with the EVM, testing with the EVM, etc. And so bringing those two worlds together obviously leads to this kind of chemical reaction, as you mentioned. The kind of applications that we're talking about here are natively cross-chain. And so what do I mean by that? There's in today's world, there are all sorts of applications that espouse cross-chain ideas. They want to be cross-chain, but they're secured by trustful bridges, right? They're not secured by like client proof supported bridging protocols like IBC. And this is, remember, natively built into Cosmos chains. IBC is. It's so far one of the only protocols that has never been hacked as far as a bridging protocol goes. And we want to be careful about what bridging means, because there's like liquidity routing and there's like multi-sig bridges. And I think the term bridging is overloaded, so I want to be careful here. But IBC as a core protocol is a like client proof based trustless protocol for atomically transacting across the security boundaries of different blockchain zones. Let's call them. And that's great. That's the missing ingredient here, because now builders can build applications that don't require things like multi-chain deployments. So in today's EVM landscape, you have like Aave that is deployed not just to Ethereum, not just to chain X, but chain Y and Z and A and B and C also, right? And so all these deployments need to be managed independently, and that fragments the developer mindshare, that fragments the user mindshare, that fragments the liquidity available on each of these spots, right?
And it creates a situation where we have to vote for whether to deploy Uni to Binance chain, BNB chain, But you know,
Absolutely.
how many votes can you do if in the world of many more chains? Uniswap seems pretty fundamental to a EVM chain, gotta say. Or
Right
something
on.
like Uniswap or Uniswap clone. And the fact that we're thinking about clone just because they can't move is actually kind of, if you think about it, somewhat ridiculous.
I mean, this is where you get an ecosystem of just forks, right?
Right.
Which is not in itself an issue. Just want to point out, but there is some sort of lethargy here, some sort of like friction. There's
Right.
like a cognitive overhead incurred by governance. Like I've heard it called governance fatigue, right? When you have to
Yeah.
vote to deploy all these applications, right? It's like
Right,
a
right,
huge
right.
hassle, right?
Yeah, it's like I think the U.S. Congress needs to vote to approve a new post office renaming itself. Like it's still a thing, right? Apparently, they still do it. It seems like that.
I
Of course, yeah,
Yeah, I love that analogy. But yeah, it's kind of like if you think about it and compare it back to the Web 2 ethos, right? It's kind of like wild to me that we've chosen that this is an acceptable way to develop like applications. It's not even secure, right? Because if there's a new patch, you need to distribute that to
yeah, yeah,
all of your deployments, and it's just really difficult to manage from a developer experience standpoint.
absolutely,
And so, what if I told you you could deploy once and use anywhere?
right.
Right. And that's kind of where we're going here. And like Osmosis
I
kind of
see it. Yeah,
has kind of demonstrated a model like this with outposts, where Osmosis as a chain has deployed like its chain. But what about all the users elsewhere? Well, they should be able to use Osmosis is a cross chain cross chain
right.
decentralized exchange, and so users on other chains should also be able to use Osmosis's liquidity from wherever they are. They
Right.
shouldn't have to go to Osmosis's like chain, its front end, to interact with it. They should just be able to use it with the private key that they use for signing like their like native. If they're a Juno user, their Juno transactions. If they're an
Right,
Evmos
right,
user,
right.
their Evmos transactions, etc.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like the future that we're espousing here, where you just have one account, you use that to sign for everything. Now there's like issues around like privacy and security of
Yeah.
securing one. You relying on one
Yeah.
private
That's a
key.
security hygiene concern, not a application capability concern, right?
Right. But keep in mind that what I mentioned is one account to interact with everything, not one private key. And this is where
I
things
see.
like account abstraction become relevant, because you need to be able to upgrade the protocol to espouse like new methods of account verification, new account types that are like, let's say, multi-sig by default, or have social recovery built into the chain. These are all things that Web2 users are accustomed to, like being able to recover your password, for example, that Web3 users are just, kind of, out of luck with.
Right.
And again, it all goes back to this ethos of like, the way we frame it is the next million Web3 users are just users.
Right.
If we want to target that future, how do we get there? If we want to target a future where the next million decentralized applications are just applications, are the developer experience of building with dApps, with decentralized applications of the future, is natively cross-chain and is either at parity with the current Web2 developer experience or even better than the current Web2 developer experience. How do we get to that future? That's what we always ask ourselves. And I think that Evmos serves a core piece of that by providing this hub, this central spot where you can facilitate cross-chain interactions that are built natively on an EVM, and you can, access cross-chain capabilities from your smart contracts natively.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because if you look at account abstraction, the work that's being done in the EVM space, you will see that some of these application and closer user concerns are being solved. And, let's say Nodes are Safe, which is we're part of the Safe Guardian kind of a group of people trying to figure out how to do account abstraction in a way that's native to the EVM way of doing things, and compatible and provide the usability and the deployment stack already with compatibility with people knowing that smart contract wallet is the thing and to be trusted. It would be great to see that just like, oh, okay, now Evmos have that. Now, what can you do if those interactions can instantly cross-chain and you don't have to deploy the same payment system in 6 places? You can settle payment here, you can settle minting there, you can have the social profile that is the follow account open here, and you can have the ability to get recognized on airdrop somewhere else. And you can even have an Oracle listening for all those activity. But the fact that you don't have to have 4 different assets and bridge and waiting, 12 blocks or however long that might be to have this interaction, I think that's really interesting, right? So you don't have to pick a clan or pick a group and say, okay, I'm going to only serve this one. I'm going to be the Polygon clan. I'm going to be AVAX clan, which, by the way, doesn't really overlap. Right? And it's sad, right? Because if you build for EVM, there's no reason you're not in the same underlying kind of pool.
Absolutely. You're touching on a really, really important point, which is like this kind of like weird blockchain tribalism, kind of treating each chain as kind of a cult. So in that way, we think of Evmos as the anti-blockchain, where if Evmos fulfills the vision that we're talking about, nobody will ever know that you're using Evmos on the back end.
Right.
Nobody will ever know what chain your application lives on. You as the end user and you as the developer only need to care about building your application and deploying to the stack that makes the most sense for your application.
Right.
From there, users who secretly, in an abstract way, use Evmos on the back end can reach your application, whether that's deployed on Evmos or elsewhere.
Right.
Can reach your application and interact with it without ever needing to know that it's not on Evmos or it is on Evmos and they're coming from somewhere else. Right. And that's kind of, again, I always kind of repeat this quote, that's the future we're kind of building for. And what you just said is a super important aspect of this, is like kind of breaking up the blockchain tribalism here, because you don't see this with Web2 again, you don't see like people kind of coalescing around Facebook.com or Amazon.com and kind of like competing, having those compete. You can say, I love this product over this product because they do similar things.
It's much less tribal. Yeah, you don't see DevOps people like, I love the Google Cloud and I will not be, seen with an AWS t-shirt on, right? Like that level of tribalism doesn't exist. And yes, there's affiliation of tool sets and stuff like that. I think it's because the choice is really consequential. It's almost like if you choose to live in a particular part of town, you know that town shut down its bridges every 6 months and you're just with each other for and then you can't go somewhere else. There's consequences to the choices you make. And I think it'll be good in the world, whether that's through greater interoperability on the tools, like having standard plugs and stuff like that. But it's just movement of value is really more important than standardization of plugs, right? So I feel like the IBC introduced that movement in a much more instantaneous way without waiting for customs to clear your package after 12 blocks. Mixing metaphors again. No, I think this is really fantastic, and I'm really, really thankful that you were able to walk us through essentially not only what your manifesto said. We are in a juncture, right? We're at a juncture where there are different types of interoperability thesis, to be honest, right? That the rollout thesis is one, using state channels and other type of like third party, like what Chainlink is doing with CCIP. And it's like, well, if you're going to trust one person to help you, coordinate, trust us, which is not terrible, right?
No.
But that's one way. And we are also seeing that, we can have any blockchain you can have in the Celestia as long as you have us as your storage layer, which is, again, not an assumption you can make universally. So there are a lot of standards for people to choose from, and it's still in this mixing the tribalism. What I love about hearing what you're saying is that the root of the interoperability thesis exists in the Cosmos ecosystem in the purest form before the tribalism happens. And it's still here. It is still being worked on. It's still showing its thing. And that, to me, it's amazing.
It's truly a wonderful thing. I mean, I'm shocked by the Cosmos ethos over and over again. And then looking back on Cosmos, I can't take any credit for this, by the way, but looking back on how early Cosmos was to app chain thesis. I mean, today
Absolutely.
you've got Polkadot, you've got Optimism, you've got Polygon.
Right.
You've got Avalanche, right? All building their
with
own
subnets,
stacks,
right? Like with the subnets and the subgroup and subnetwork. I don't know what they call it now. Supernet.
Yeah. So polygons are supernets. Optimism is building the OP stack. Polkadot has Substrate, where they're building
Substrate,
parachains.
yeah, right, exactly.
They've been around for a little bit longer than the rest. And then Avalanche, as you mentioned, is building subnets. All these folks are kind of understanding that the Cosmos app chain thesis was right.
Yep.
And are kind of building their own stacks for it. And in that way, I'm like, wow, yeah, Cosmos.
Yeah, like
Cosmos
nobody give a prize for like, hey, you were right the whole time. Like nobody stops and say, hey, can we just acknowledge that is like evident in like 100 proofs that this is correct. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I think the folks, like Jaquan, Ethan Buckman, Zaki Manian, like all these people are kind of just like have their arms kind of folded and are smiling to themselves. Like, 8 years ago we were we got something right. So props to them. Seriously.
Yeah, it's awesome. So what about the proliferation of Ethereum and Fox? Is that something like you would talk about the boats and the boat becoming more boats?
Yeah.
Ships become more ships?
No, great. Yeah, thank you for circling back. So if we talk about cross-chain applications and we talk about Evmos being kind of like this hub to facilitate cross-chain interactions, well, then all of these chains have to have a home to have homes to live on. Like all of these applications need their own stacks to be cross-chain. Cross-chain involves more than just one chain, and so Evmos is one piece of the puzzle. Evmos, the chain, is one piece of the puzzle, and the other piece of the puzzle covered in the manifesto is the Evmos SDK. So I mentioned all these other SDKs, right? These stacks being built, but the Evmos SDK, I think, is kind of going to be prolific, not because it's again better, whatever that means, right? But because it's non-prescriptive. I think if you're building with Avalanche subnets, you have to build in the Avalanche ecosystem, right? If you're building with the OP stack, it might need to be a rollup. I can't really speak for any of these stacks specifically because I haven't myself used them.
Each time I have a conversation is a little bit different, and I feel like I'm not being precise there.
Sure. But the thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to build an all-encompassing stack for sovereign chains. For chains that might have nothing to do with Evmos at the end of the day, right? It's a stack to build into your chain any governance-controlled smart contract you want, right? Similar to like how Conto works, which I think we'll talk about in a second. Any EIP you want, any EVM extension that either we or somebody else develops that basically empowers smart contracts past the point that Ethereum kind of left off. So basically gives smart contracts access to IBC, gives smart contracts access to staking, gives smart contracts access to voting. So if you can have, right now users can vote natively on chain, but smart contracts can't. So if we can extend smart contracts to be able to vote, that means people can build real DAO tooling infrastructure that can have a say in their own native chain's governance. So you can have applications that like coordinate and all the governance structures that have been built up on things like Gnosis Chain, which is why I love Gnosis Chain. You can port them over and have them be able to run on their own chains built with the Evmos SDK, right? And the developer journey, again, we build for developers primarily. We think about the end user, but only through the lens of a developer, right? And so when you think about a developer who's building on Evmos, for example, they say, okay, this is the place where I want to deploy my EVM, smart contract product. But eventually, I know that I want to spin out into my own chain, right? Because I know that I will scale far beyond the block space limitations of Evmos, or I know that Evmos doesn't have the EVM extensions that I need. Right. I am going to spin off into my own chain within the Cosmos ecosystem, and I'll still be able to communicate with Evmos, right? Even though my liquidity might still live on Evmos, my application logic will live on this this other chain that has its own stack that is purpose built for that logic, right? And I'll just use the liquidity that's still on Evmos and talk cross-chain to it and have my users control that liquidity, or I'll just find another way to migrate. Either way, it's going to be really easy for me to spin off into my own chain by building on Evmos, by starting
Yeah.
off my journey on Evmos.
And then what's interesting about what you just said that in this app chain, in this spun off chain, the governance and the fee structure of the blockchain, assuming the extension exists to make it available to people who are primarily dealing with the smart contract, allows you to integrate essentially the whole compensation model. In a way that's just not a token, we can actually be deeper than that, whether it's at the depth of what would be equivalent to an Ethereum depth or even deeper than that, right? Because you can participate further in the larger Cosmos ecosystem.
Exactly. Like Cosmos lets you build any application layer logic as a module. So what we're targeting is allowing developers to build a stack that leverages EVM functionality like they're used to, but also allows them to customize the logic to their needs, right? And whether they want to be Ethereum equivalent or not is up to them, right? So Evmos will always be EVM equivalent, right? With Ethereum. But what that means is if we want to break Ethereum compatibility, if we want to break Ethereum equivalence in the future, all that means is we just launch another EVM chain in Cosmos built with the Evmos SDK that talks to Evmos. And I'll give you an example. So for example, for account abstraction, I don't think there's a world where it would make sense to change Evmos's account model, right? Because at the protocol level, right? And I think Ethereum is using is going with some off-chain application layer solutions for account abstraction. I know there's a debate. I wouldn't consider it real account abstraction, personally speaking, but it works for the purposes that people want. I know like James Prestwich has come out and talked a little bit about what he thinks about the account abstraction model that Ethereum folks are going forward with. Yeah. And I actually don't know what the status is. I know that every year there's basically a new account abstraction model that's proposed, and this has been the case since 2018.
Yep. Anyway, it will continue.
For Evmos, what we can do is actually just launch a new chain that has account abstraction built into the protocol. So it gives you the ability to whitelist new wallet types as smart contracts. And as a user, you deploy a wallet type. Maybe that's a multi-sig wallet by default. Maybe that's a multi-sig wallet with social recovery. And if there are new wallets in the future, you can just whitelist them through governance. And from there, you can interact with every other chain in the Cosmos ecosystem over IBC using your wallet on this chain. It doesn't need to live on Evmos. It can interact with all the Evmos applications, right? But it doesn't natively need to live on Evmos. Now, I'm not saying that all the liquidity and TVL and whatever will be built up on this wallet chain, right? The wallet chain just serves as a home for your identity and your identity layer logic. Let's say if you wanted to use multiple private keys and have them all sign for a single account and use that account, then that's very possible, right? And if you want to have different privileges, kind of in a different kind of model where I'm struggling to there's an OAuth model. Kind of if you want to assign OAuth level privileges to different tokens, you can totally do that and encode all this logic on this wallet chain. But you don't need to change. You don't need to upgrade Evmos to encode all this new logic. You can just extend what's possible on Evmos via this new chain, right? And that's kind of the future.
Compatibility layer is essentially the inter-blockchain communication and then the layer on top that it is calling these methods, right?
Exactly.
But the way you control I love this idea of a wallet chain, right? Because what's happening without wallet chain coordinated logic, the automation is non-existent. I think the one thing that makes Web3 better than Web2 is assuming automation that people pay company like Zapier to do becomes something that just exists, right? So you can just automate based on threshold, agency, grant based on permission, time limited. It could be a bot, it could be a swarm of bots, it could be an AI acting as a bot. It doesn't really matter, right? But that requires account abstraction, first of all. Two, it requires a lot of user agency-based communication that is not really about settlement. It's really about these agents acting on the user's behalf. Can you imagine how much logic that needs to run on this wallet chain just to process that? I don't think you should be doing that on a settlement chain from a gas point of view, but 100%. It totally makes sense for me to say, do 700 cycles of user automation thinking and one transaction through a multi-core type of interface on the settlement chain or on 100%. Multiple settlement chain. I think that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, and so the term I was looking for earlier just came to me is capabilities based, right? Capabilities based privilege assignment, right? Like OAuth.
That's awesome.
And yeah, the model here is I'm not even saying this needs to be an L1, right? The SDK, as I mentioned, is not going to be prescriptive. If you and Celestia already has kind of defined the path forward for the modular stack. So if you want to build a chain and you're worried about security, well, have the wallet chain, and I love that we're using this as an example, but it really applies to any future product that you want to build. Yeah. Have the wallet chain share security with the Cosmos Hub, for example, that has that is backed by millions of dollars worth of Atom, or have it act as a rollup that settles to a different chain, that settles to Ethereum, right? If you're worried about data availability, or Celestia, if you're worried about data availability. The Evmos SDK, if done right, and it's still sort of under development, right? So I can't kind of predict it's just going to be this level of success and everything is going to be built with it. But it's not prescriptive, and that's the point, right? We don't want you by default to settle to any one layer, right? Like even Evmos, right? Like I would love for Evmos to see more usage, right? But again, that's not the point of the Evmos SDK. The Evmos SDK is to facilitate your developer experience in your journey to porting your smart contract product, smart contract application, and have it find product market fit as on top of a stack that is purpose built for it. So if that means you build a rollup, or if that means you build a consumer chain that shares security, so be it.
Yeah, I think that is a beautiful roadmap. What's most interesting about this roadmap, and as it relates to the last hour or so we spent together, is that you walked us through the road, right? Like we literally walked from the very beginning of the road with Jaquan saying, waving at you, and then going, all the way to the point where we're at the cusp of opportunity with people, screaming for account abstraction, swimming for ability to do things that are Web2 like, that may be too difficult to change the underlying assumption of the one true global computer. But if we stop thinking about the global computer as a mainframe and start thinking about it as a Docker container where everybody just spins up 100 of different versions of it and then use microservices to tie it together, I think we're approaching that moment of the Dockerization of blockchain. Again, it's obviously an internet in the way to communicate, but something deeper than that, which is it's the same thing over and over again with slight variations. And that slight variation is really where the evolution is going to happen, because we need mutation and variation and experimentation. I am a wallet maxi. I believe that wallet will end up becoming the most important replacement for the agent that acts on behalf of the user. I think the user being the agent that acts on every transaction is just the absolute wrong model. And then once you say the user will act sometime to set their intent, and then smart contracts or logic will act most of the time, I would say 90% of the time. Right. Capability that you're talking about, this capability model, this delegation model becomes important. And it's really hard to do that entirely from a browser plugin, right? That doesn't make any sense. Your configuration is that.
I'm shocked that we've still stuck on the same signing models that we've been using since the beginning, right? I mean, we've evolved, we have new signing modes and whatnot, but the mechanism of interaction with signing it for a transaction has not changed at the protocol level in a very long time. And I brought the wallet chain up because it's very top of mind for me as kind of like the next thing.
And it is one thing that I know that the current approach can't do, because that atomicity of communication, assigning, is what a wallet do. And to see that state of your own personal state, your wallet state, it could even be a whale have their own chain. I'm going to run my own thing. I'm not going to tell you what's going on exactly. I may obfuscate, but my trades settle outside. It could be really interesting. So I'm really glad we ended there, because it's very easy when we talk about layer one, say everything's is possible and everything will happen. But there are usually something where it's like there's a yearning for a thing. There's, we ran into this roadblock due to lack of composability and the delegation to the wallet being the all-powerful thing, and yet itself being extremely unpowerful. And then it could be interesting to like throw smart contract at that problem, not just Gnosis Save, which is obviously one step and probably a really important part of that, but something that we've discussed today. Wow, this is fascinating. This is so good. I hope
I'm glad you're kind of taking. I'm glad this makes you excited, and you're kind of taking this in your own direction as well.
For sure, yeah. And I'm glad this example. I mean, I think you pick wallet chain as one of many things, and I want to make that clear. There's many applications that's unlocked with the composability of state in a kind of like function call basis and the internet basis, but also the tooling that exists in that global local computer, like thinking of these like EVM as local, and then the network being the IBC's Cosmos aspects of it. But to me, that just felt like it's land straight into a proof that if we are going to be successful in getting Web2 users to migrate to the land of the Web3, which is a diverse field of different things, but all loosely part of the citizen that of Web3, which is signatures and signing 100%. And keys and stuff like that. So we use land of Web3 as the organizing principle, like the land of the free. But again, the land of the free has a lot of different governance, a lot of different things. Possibly one currency, one liquidity. But at the end of the day, I think it's important that we control how our household, our town, our city in a different way, and yet still be compatible. And I think that vision has come and it's fulfilled in some part.
Even just on this last sentence, talking about fees and whatnot, there's so much to be said about what the future of fees in the land of Web3 might look like, and how we can map that back to Web2's experience. But I think we don't have time. What I will leave you on before we go, I know you mentioned yearning. There's like this yearning for a future like this, and kind of the first signal for us, taking a step back, the first kind of indicator, like the way we started was like in a world of like largely kind of undifferentiated, specifically EVM block space, where does Evmos go? Like what's unique to the Cosmos ecosystem that we can pull on? And it was like this interoperability thesis, and kind of looking at when Evmos launched. By the time Evmos launched, there were many other Evmos forks in the works, right? Like Kronos is an Evmos fork. Kanto launched recently. I'm sure you and the audience have heard here. And that's an Evmos fork. Kava is a chain that had been running for a long time before Evmos launched. And when Evmos launched, Kava incorporated the EVM into it. Yeah. So there's all these models for, we kind of looked around, we were like, what is going on here? We thought Evmos was kind of the product, and it still, kind of is. We have a whole roadmap for it, but there's this other additional thing that's happening. It's that Ethermint, the EVM in Cosmos, this interoperable cross-chain EVM has found product market fit kind of on its own.
Right.
So how do we take that to the next, what's the next logical step in its evolution? And that was the Evmos SDK.
Absolutely. And I think encouraging more of that, I mean, when I heard about like sharing gas fees in some ways with the people who use the smart contract, was a bit of a like breaking my own mental model of like where big things begin and where things end. But that's really what technology is about, breaking assumptions and then like reassembling it again in a way that is different than was before. It's just not better and more, it's different and disruptive. That word has lost its meaning, but it is, and that disruption, that renewal is why we can keep going. Otherwise, we'll just be fossilized infrastructure. It's like, well, it's like Paris. You can't build anything in it. And that won't be very fun for 200-300 years, right? So I hope that this idea that there's a product market fit for experimentation, yet still basing not like from the scratch, we'll build the whole thing, but actually just taking kind of like how Docker container, taking Linux and all the thing that is, and just package it in a new way. I see that. And it's so exciting to know that the work that it takes to make this happen may sound boring and parody and kind of like just bug squashing, but what opens up on the other side is quite glorious. And it's, in fact, the Web3 vision that we all had along.
100%. I think I've said that like five, 6 times so far. But yeah, I think I'm aligned with that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for walking us through your personal journey, but also more importantly, how our collective journey can actually be a collective journey. I think a lot of times we forget that in the Web3 is like, who's the winner in today's elimination tournament and who is going to get kicked out of the island today? I definitely felt that, but it feels like while that's going on, the ideas that congeals and sometimes the idea outliving the people still working on them is really where it becomes a magical ecosystem. Ecosystem is not about this particular bacteria lasting 20 years, but the fact that the DNA lives on and it is in everything. I think we're seeing that actually working out ecologically, and it's wonderful to see that you continue cultivating, because at the end of the day, there has to be a hand to make something happen, but hopefully we get surprised of what is left behind and what gets created in the work that we put. And thank you for all the work that you put into this.
For sure. Well, thank you for spreading the word.
Well, thank you again, as always, to the community for your time and attention. I hope these content, especially from the people who have lived it, breathed it, made it, and continue to make it. And that is one of the joy of doing this podcast, is I'm talking to people not 20 years after they made the album, but right in the middle of them trying to put the final mix together. It's so exciting. And to have that. And Nick, thank you so much for your time. And as always, the community, thanks for your time and your attention. Until next time, take care.